All right, good day, everyone, and welcome back to Civics and Economics. So, today we're going to be diving into our first unit, which is the foundations of government. And our first lesson is going to explore English influences and how the Enlightenment documents influenced American colonial government. So, what is the Enlightenment anyway? You should remember this from world history, but if not, here's a refresher. The Enlightenment era, or the Age of Reason, as it was called, was a period in time where philosophers began to question traditional authority and embrace the notion that humanity could be improved through rational change. Well, the French and the American revolutions were directly inspired by Enlightenment ideals, and unfortunately, they respectively marked the peak of its influence and ultimately the beginning of its decline. But before we get ahead of ourselves, we need to go back to 1215 and talk about King John and the Magna Carta. So, the Magna Carta was signed in 1215 by King John, and around 1215, England and its king were beginning to clash. So, the country and its people had honestly experienced years of unsuccessful foreign policies and a lot of heavy taxes at the sign of the king. Under massive political pressure, King John signed the Carta, and it effectively placed him and all of England's future monarchs under the rule of law. Now, the charter was not initially effective, but it was reissued in 1216, 1217, and 1225, where it ultimately served as the foundation for the English system of common law. And at its very core, this document signaled freedom from oppression by giving the people more power than the king. And in 1776, during the founding fathers would look to this document as historical precedent for asserting their liberty from the British crown. But substantively, the document also guaranteed due process and a trial by jury. Remember this: if the king didn't like you, you would simply disappear. Okay? This was a massive advancement in rights and the establishment of the rule of law. The Magna Carta established due process, or the legal procedures to ensure that a person's rights were protected under the rule of law. An example of this is if you are arrested, the police must read you your Miranda rights, specifically alerting you to the fact that anything you say or do can be used against you in a court of law. Another and possibly more basic example is that you must be found guilty of a crime before you can be sentenced and sent to jail. Now, we've talked about the king and how the Magna Carta gave more rights to the people, but the Glorious Revolution spurred activism in government and the idea of political rights. Now, prior to 1688, the king had the final say, but after that, the Parliament, or England's lawmaking body, became more powerful than the king. Now, the English Parliament is very much like our English Congress. All right, so let's take a second here. So, which document limited the power of the king? Go ahead and write it down to yourself or think about it. And then lastly, what is the lawmaking body in England? We just talked about both of those things. All right, so in 1689, the English Bill of Rights was signed into law. Here we have William III and Mary II, who became the co-rulers of England after the overthrow of James II. All right, the Bill of Rights is the first constitutional document of England. All right, it outlined the basic civil and political rights that each citizen had. Again, this is incredibly novel for the time. The Bill of Rights gave Parliament power of the monarchy and was the foundation and the inspiration for the U.S. Bill of Rights, which we'll talk about in a few units. So this document further limited the power of the king and guaranteed freedoms that we ultimately take for granted now, like free elections, the elimination of cruel and unusual punishment, the right to bear arms, and freedom of speech. Now, let's talk about freedom of speech for a second. Remember, this was a very scary political time. I mean, if you remember, people were being executed over their religious preferences. So the idea of freedom of speech or the right to verbally speak out against the king was incredibly new. That's huge. Okay? Now, all of this is to say that a legal system that looks familiar to us today was being built during this time, specifically through the use of what's called common law, which is law based on precedent or law based on rulings in similar previous cases. If we look here at the map, we'll notice that North America, for the most part, with the exception of Mexico and a little bit of Central America, is all this dark blue. That denotes common law. Okay. Other places that we have common law, Australia, if we look over across the Atlantic, we'll see England, Scotland, Ireland. Now, all of these places have incredible English influences. So it's no surprise that they are based on an English set of law, which is common law. All right, that's our lecture for today. Thanks for listening.